Welcome back to the Bible Reading Challenge podcast. My name is Aaron Ventura, and in this episode, we're going to look at the book of Esther. You can find a written version of this episode along with a lot more over at localchristendom.com. If you have questions, you can reach me at aaronventura@gmail.com, or you can use the message box on the website. The book of Esther is one of the last narratives in the Hebrew Bible, and it brings the history of Israel to a dramatic climax. We are told in the opening verse that Esther takes place in the days of Ahasuerus. And if we piece together and harmonize Esther with the chronology in Daniel and Ezra Nehemiah, we can identify this Ahasuerus as the same king who is elsewhere called Darius or Artaxerxes. As with titles like Pharaoh or President, Ahasuerus is not a personal name, but a throne name, a title that means King of Kings or Chief of Rulers. This is the same king under whom Haggai and Zechariah prophesied, but is not to be confused with Darius the Mede or Cyrus. So this would place Esther's coronation as queen in 515 BC, about 70 years after Babylon's destruction of the temple. So by this time, the events of Daniel's life have already taken place. Mordecai, who was originally brought to Babylon in the first wave of exiles, but then returned to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, you can read about that in Ezra 2, he is now an old man and a magistrate living in Persia, in Shushan, the capital there. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, 1,400 miles away, Haggai and Zechariah have encouraged the Jews, and the reconstruction of the temple has just been completed. So that was completed in 516 BC. This is a significant moment in Jewish history that inaugurates the era of what we now call Second Temple Judaism. And it is at this moment that the events of Esther begin to unfold. When Ahasuerus came to power, the Persian Empire was in turmoil and needed to be reunited. After a year or so of reconquering the kingdom, there was this immense pressure to find some way of keeping peace amongst so many diverse people groups. The opening verses of Esther emphasize this immense size of the Persian Empire, 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. This is a bit smaller than the United States, but think about it. They did not have airplanes, they didn't have a shared national identity, they didn't have email or any other kind of instant means of communication. So the capital of Persia was Shushan, which is in modern-day Iran, and that's about 1,400 miles from Jerusalem. So to govern an empire of this size would require a high level of political skill, peacekeeping, and public relations. This explains why Ahasuerus throws a 6-month-long, 180-day feast for his nobles, princes, officials, and servants. These were the lesser magistrates in charge of holding the Persian Empire together. And this context is crucial for understanding the actions of each character in the Esther narrative. Let's talk briefly about the literary structure of Esther, and there are a few different ways you could outline the book, but on the whole, it is structured as two stories that parallel each other. So the king needs a new queen to replace Vashti, and the king needs a new advisor to replace Haman. Esther and Mordecai will, of course, fill these roles. So the first half of Esther revolves around Haman's plot against the Jews, and there is a turning point in chapter 6 where Mordecai is exalted, and then the second half of the book is the unraveling and undoing of Haman's plans. So as with the Joseph story in Genesis, the Esther narrative reveals that what the enemy intends for evil, God intends for good. Or as the proverb says, whoever digs a pit will himself fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him. One of the other major themes of Esther is feasting and Sabbath rest. So there are 9 feasts that are listed in Esther, and the first 3 are in chapter 1, and they culminate with Vashti's rebellion on the 7th day against the king. And this is meant to remind us of Adam and Eve's rebellion in the garden on the Sabbath. The text draws our attention to this parallel in Esther 1:5 when it says that the feast took place in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So Vashti has become a new serpent of sorts, a new Eve, disobeying the king's command and seeking to undermine his authority. The fourth feast is the wedding and coronation feast of Esther. After this, we have Esther's 2 feasts for the king and Haman, and then Mordecai arranges for a feast of celebration before the days and feasts of Purim take place. So this is something of a public relations campaign to signify that the king is now on the side of the Jews. And it is here that we read, in every province and city wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. That's Esther 8:17. So God has set a table before the Jews in the presence of their enemies. And through this feast, God brings many people into the kingdom of heaven. Finally, there are the 2 feasts of Purim, one on the 14th of Adar and a second one on the 15th of Adar. And these feasts anticipate the wedding supper of the Lamb, Revelation 19:9, where Christ comes as the true Ahasuerus, the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords, to destroy the beast, the enemy, and his armies, Revelation 19:16. All right, well, let's talk now about each character, because I find that a lot of people misunderstand what is actually happening in this book. They aren't sure who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. I mean, everyone agrees that Haman is a bad guy, but there's questions about Ahasuerus, about Vashti, whether she did the right thing or the wrong thing. There's questions about Mordecai. There's even questions about Esther. And so there's details in the text that we should pay attention to. And so I want to point to some of those as we go through each character. And we'll start with King Ahasuerus. Many treatments of Ahasuerus present him as this kind of drunken, immoral tyrant who no woman would want to be married to. But this is just not how the text portrays him at all. At this point in history, Ahasuerus is actually God's anointed. He is the Messiah, the Mashiach, the anointed one, just like his predecessor Cyrus. So this does not mean that Ahasuerus never sins, but it does mean that he is sitting on the throne of David, and in that sense, he is a type of Christ, and he foreshadows Christ's coming perfect universal kingdom. So we see in the first chapter that far from being impulsive, Ahasuerus is actually a very patient and wise ruler. He gives a generous feast for his subordinates and does not make drinking compulsory. That's Esther 1:8. He allows them to eat and drink as they please. This is a level of toleration that you do not actually see in a place like Babylon. So if you remember the story of Daniel, he and his 3 friends had to get a special exemption to not eat the king's meat and drink. So that's in Daniel chapter 1. So Ahasuerus is actually giving more liberty to these magistrates, to these people, than many rulers before him. After Queen Vashti refuses to come before the king, what does he do? He doesn't lash out against her. He doesn't say burn her on the spot or behead her. No, he actually stops and seeks out counsel from the wise men. And we're told explicitly that these were wise men who understood the times. And then we're given this little aside. For this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice. This says something about the kind of king that Ahasuerus is. So in other words, he's not this impulsive tyrant. We're told that he is a king who seeks safety, wisdom in the multitude of counselors. That's what a wise ruler should do. In biblical and secular symbolism, the wife of the king is an embodiment and representation of the kingdom. So the king is a symbolic father and husband to the nation. The queen is a symbolic kind of mother and wife, or to use New Testament language, Christ is our head and husband. The church, we are the body and the bride. And we're actually told in Esther 1:11 that the king desired to show this beauty, the queen's beauty, to the people and the officials. So this was not just a bragging instance of my wife is hotter than your wife, but a display of royal beauty that signified the beauty of the Persian Empire. This is what Vashti represented. So for Vashti to refuse her husband and king's command was actually to destabilize the unity of the empire and the whole social order. If the queen does not even listen to the king, why should anyone else? Why should all of these nations that he just had to go reconquer? So Vashti's refusal, if handled foolishly, could actually mean the dismantling of the Persian Empire. So this is a really big deal. Let's talk a little bit more about Queen Vashti. So Vashti's refusal to obey the king was sinful and wrong on multiple levels. So first of all, just as a wife, this was a direct refusal to submit to Ahasuerus as her husband. Nowhere does the text say or suggest that the king commanded her to come out naked or wearing just the crown, as some fanciful commentators think. That's not in the text. It's not there. That's not what happened. Second, God requires those who are in places of authority and honor to be examples to those who look up to them. So it's a greater sin for a parent to lie and steal than for a 5-year-old kid to do the same. It's more heinous in the eyes of God for a pastor or elder to commit adultery than for some teenager in the congregation to do the same. God had put Vashti in the highest place of honor in the whole world. And yet she uses her position to actually model rebellion, to model a sinful behavior in the home for other women and wives in the kingdom. Third, and more relevant to the story of Esther, Vashti was a symbol of Mother Persia. In an empire with 127 different provinces, peoples of different languages, cultures, the queen was this universal symbol of what it meant to be Persian above all else, right? She was married to the king. She was the principle of unity that Ahasuerus needed to help keep the empire together. And this is what makes Vashti's refusal not just some domestic dispute, but an actual threat to national security. And this is why the king has to call his council together to decide what must be done to contain the damage, right? So if you're just a husband and your wife doesn't come into the room when you ask her to, you shouldn't call a council of all your buddies to decide what must be done to my wife. So this was a public spectacle. This was a power play that Vashti is making. And so Ahasuerus needs to decide, what can we do so this doesn't spread throughout the whole kingdom? Now, the solution to Vashti's rebellion is to replace her with a new queen who embodies and represents true Persian values. So the council suggests this empire-wide beauty pageant of sorts. And it's not just to find the king a new wife because he was lonely, but to find a faithful wife to be this new Mother Persia, a woman from the people, for the people, and representative of them. And you can see this in that anyone in the whole kingdom, this enormous kingdom of the world, any woman could possibly become the king's wife. Now, Esther's name in Hebrew is Hadassah, which means myrtle, and this represents the Jews in the time after the exile. In Nehemiah, Isaiah, and Zechariah, the myrtle tree is used as a symbol for God's people. It says in Isaiah 55:13, "Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress tree, and instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree. And it shall be to the Lord for a name, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off." So Vashti is like Israel in their rebellion against God. She is a briar that God divorces. Esther, on the other hand, is a myrtle tree. She is chosen out from among all the nations as God's favored one. And the question before Esther and before all the Jews at this time is, will you be faithful and bear witness before the world, or will you hide your light and your identity under a bushel? Now, at first, Esther does not bear witness. She listens to her father instead of her husband. And this accounts for why there is a second gathering of virgins in Esther 2:19-20. You may have wondered, if Ahasuerus loved Esther so much, why is there gathering of virgins again? This also explains why later on Esther says that she has not been called before the king for 30 days. So the text hints at the reasoning for this as being Esther's submission and obedience to Mordecai rather than Ahasuerus, her husband. Esther has failed to leave and cleave to her husband as she ought to do, and perhaps at some level Ahasuerus does not fully trust her. This may also explain why Haman was promoted instead of Mordecai. God is teaching his people that the way to authority is through bearing faithful witness regardless of the consequences, just like Daniel did, rather than being ashamed or deceptive about who they are. Well, let's talk now about Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's cousin, but he's older by quite a bit, such that he becomes her father by adoption. And we are told that they are both from the royal line of Saul in the tribe of Benjamin. So after being taken into exile as a young man and then returning to Jerusalem for a time, Mordecai is now very old, and he is this magistrate in the courts in the gates of Persia. So the prophet Jeremiah had given the Jews specific instructions for how to conduct themselves under this this new regime. You could read Jeremiah 29 and other places to see that. Daniel and his 3 friends were exemplary in obeying this and being faithful to God's word through Jeremiah. So they honor the king, they seek the peace of the city, and yet they do not compromise or hide their identity as Jews. So Daniel bears witness even unto death. Mordecai, on the other hand, is a mixed bag. He saves the life of the king, but also tells Esther to conceal who she is. Mordecai, kind of like the Pharisees in Jesus' day, is more concerned about politics, about their place in the nation, than obeying the clear commands of God. There was nothing idolatrous or sinful about bowing to honor Haman. We see this custom of bowing throughout the Old Testament. Paul says in Romans 13, we are to give honor to whom honor is due, custom to whom custom is due, and Mordecai refuses to do this. And this should remind us of someone who refused to honor their authority earlier at the beginning of the book, namely Vashti. Now Mordecai is doing the same thing, and he's putting the entire Jewish nation in danger as a result. This was the same sin that the Jews in Jeremiah's day were committing. They trusted in their political maneuvering rather than submitting to the authorities that God had appointed over them. Finally, let's talk about Haman. So Haman is the arch villain of the story, and we are told that he is an Agagite in Esther 3:1. And we are given these details of both Haman and Mordecai's lineage because the story of Esther is actually a revival and conclusion of a feud that goes back 1,000 years. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul disobeys God by sparing Agag, the king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were under God's ban of harem warfare, and Israel was commanded to destroy man, woman, child, leave nothing alive. But because Saul disobeyed God, he did not fulfill this command. The kingdom is torn from him, and then Samuel the prophet hacks Agag to pieces. So the book of Esther is a fulfillment of God's promise back in Exodus 17 to utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, and the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. It was right after the exodus from Egypt that Amalek attacked Israel in the wilderness. And now 1,000 years later, Amalek again attacks them right after their exodus from Babylonian exile. Thus, Haman's plot is the last in a long war between Israel and Amalek. Well, let's conclude by talking about the meaning of Purim. Why did the Jews choose Purim as the name for this final feast? Well, just as Esther has a double name, Hadassah in Hebrew and Esther in Persian, so also the word Purim has a double name and meaning as well. We are told in Esther 9:24 that Purim means lots, and this comes from Haman casting lots to determine what day the Jews would be destroyed. And at this level, the meaning of Purim could be summarized by Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So God is sovereign over the evil schemes of men, but if you think about it, by itself, lots is kind of an odd name for this great act of God's deliverance. Why not call it Esther's feast or Mordecai's revenge? Well, the key to solving this puzzle comes in Esther 4:14, where Mordecai says to Esther, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" If you were to look back at Numbers chapter 30, there is a series of laws about a woman who makes a vow in her father or husband's house. If the father or husband remains silent, the oath that the woman makes is binding. But if he speaks up against it, he can actually annul the vow or make it void. Mordecai was, as we know, Esther's father, and he had commanded her to remain silent about her Jewish identity. But now it is time for her to speak up, and to do so against her husband and king. This is a dangerous move because of what happened to Vashti earlier. Esther is actually running the risk of dishonoring Ahasuerus by asking him to revoke a law that in Persia is irrevocable. You can also see how this reverses the roles of authority in Numbers 30 for the young woman to try to annul her husband's vow. In Hebrew, the word pur means annulment, and it is the same root word that we find all throughout Numbers 30. So pur in ancient Persian means lot, but pur in Hebrew means annulment. This is the double meaning of Purim. God works through Haman's lots and Esther's annulments to return Haman's wickedness upon his own head. This is, of course, ultimately a picture of what Jesus does on the cross. Christ takes what Satan intended for the destruction of God's people, and he turns it into their deliverance. In the greatest twist of cosmic irony, of divine comedy, Satan detonates his own kingdom. And as with all of the Jewish festivals, Purim is then a celebration of the gospel. Well, that is just a little bit of what is going on in the book of Esther. There, of course, is so much more here. And my one encouragement to you as you read this book and are trying to decide, what characters are doing the right thing and the wrong thing is you got to know God's law really well. You got to know the prophets, Jeremiah, Zechariah, the prophets of that day really well. So you can understand, okay, what is it that the Jews, faithful Jews, were supposed to be doing at this time? And so I find that reading the book of Daniel with the book of Esther is a really good comparison and contrast and parallel to what is going on, because both are put in very difficult situations in positions of power, and they have to find a way to be faithful in those circumstances. There's a great book out there by David Foreman called The Queen You Thought You Knew that I would highly recommend. And also, if you can find James Jordan's lectures on Esther, he's done a couple different series on it. You can probably go to Word MP3 to find those. Those are great as well. All right, well, that's the book of Esther. Until next time, keep on reading.